So in a sense, this has been two histories. On the one hand, there are 6,910 languages, and of which there are initially something like 2,500 alphabets. But in the narrower sense, there are only 42 alphabets, of which 13 are extant. And in the very narrow sense, according to Wiki, there are only 5 alphabets, in the sense of having vowels, then consonants, then vowels, and then consonants. Or, looked at differently, a set of consonants into which we interspace vowels. Those are Greek, Latin, Armenian, Georgian, and Cyrillic. And we've had two stories in another sense. That on the one hand, we have this narrow story of what happens in the West, and we pretend that everything just happened on the coasts of the Mediterranean. And yet our story has gone from Siberia and the Slavic lands on the one hand, and India on the other. And we've shown that what happened in India in terms of these big alphabets went eastwards all the way to Japan and westwards to the coasts of Africa and then north to Egypt, and from there spread out throughout what we now think of as Europe. So in this talk, which I call Evolution, I want to reflect a little about why the West has forgotten more than half the story, and also look at some of the ways in which the West has tried to understand what has happened in the past. So this is not the true story, it's the distorted story of what has happened that we have described in the book in a more comprehensive way. So I told you that in the early 1600s, a gentleman in the Vatican made a list of the 72 sacred languages. Well, I thought it'd be interesting and useful to look at some of those. So here's a little section in detail. I'll read them not in Latin, but in their modern English, so Babylonian, hieroglyphics, Apollonian, Egyptian, Gothic, Getic, Scythian, and Massagetic. Notice that they're typically in 3 lines, and they are short. They are 22 letters, 24 letters, 26 letters. There are, well, and if we go down, this gives you a glimpse of the major ones. And you see there are a few, like Germanicum, Armeniacum, that have, and Syri Armeniacum, that have a good number of more letters, but there is no evidence of any Sanskrit with 52 letters. In fact, none of the long alphabets, either of the Hindu tradition or of the Slavic tradition, are reflected at all in this. I thought it'd be useful to make a chart to show you where those alphabets come from. We see that 2 come from India, Brahmanicum and Indicum. 12 come from Middle Asia. 26 come from the Middle East. 20 come from Europe. And 9 come from Africa. So, on the surface, it's impressive, but it is more a reflection of the lands covered by the Bible, from the limits of Greece to the first bits of Iran, than a vision of the world or even of Eurasia. And when we look at the early attempts to talk about the most ancient languages of the world, here in Kircher in 1799 in his Tower of Babel, we see 22 letters, and we see Hebrew and a few languages linked to that. Or here in Erasmus Fröhlich in 1754, again 22 letters and a few variants, but no indication at all that there is a very complex Slavic set of letters or a very complex Indian set of letters, let alone that those Indian letters of 49, 50, 51, 52, or 54 letters get reduced to 33, then 26, and then 22, as we saw when Indicum goes to Ethiopia and so on. And by the time we get to Egypt, we get Egyptian 1, 2, 3. And now, remember I showed you that there were letters that had a sequence, and I said one of the sequences was AIR. Well, there you see it, AIR. So when we have these rows of 3, this is another AIR, and this is another AIR. So it's letter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 1, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. So this is the 1, 9, 17 sequence. The way we write the letters varies tremendously, but the 1, 9, 17 remains. And we said that was one of the initial ones. And then we get 1, 12, 17, which gives me ALPH, from which we get alpha. And then we have 1, 10, 19, which gives us the sequence of K2 in the nakshatras and gives us then the gematria of 110, 100. When we look at the bigger history, here is a timeline of human evolution. So there were homina, or bipedal apes, or Australopithecus and descendants 3 million years ago. Homo, or the genus Homo, human Neanderthals, Homo erectus, and their direct ancestors 2.5 million years ago. Homo sapiens about 100,000 years ago, and Homo sapiens sapiens, modern humans, about 200,000 years ago. Now, one of the very interesting things that's happening is that we have a whole archaeology based on this chronology that tells us that the humans at the Homo erectus level were started in Africa. There's hardly any doubt about that. But then around 2 million years before Christ, well, BC, but really 2 million years ago, effectively, there was a migration out of Africa towards both Europe and Asia. And 1 million years ago, there was a second migration. We don't have any clear idea of what caused that. Now, in the last 30 years, there's been a great fascination with DNA testing and using DNA to do chronology. And this has happened largely through work started in the early 90s. And what is both fascinating and very puzzling is that they are saying that this same migration out of Africa happened 65,000 or 40,000 years ago. And so we have one group saying that it happened 2 million years ago, and another group saying it happened only 60,000 years ago. And this is confusing greatly our chronologies of things. Now, the West has created its own explanation of the stories, and what's puzzling and troubling is that those stories have been accepted by the people in the East. So here is a Western-based alphabet tree in the East. The first alphabet, according to them, is Proto-Sinaitic. Earliest possible is 1900 BC. From that comes the Abjad Phoenicium, then the Abjad Aramaic, Aksara Brahmi, Aksara Kawi, and Aksara Kaganga. Now, I think this is all nonsense, but if you go to the wiki sites for these things, you will find this. Now, here is a human evolutionary tree of Homo sapiens, Homo erectus, and so on. Well, we start here, 3.5 million, and then go upwards. Here is another picture. Here is a more complicated picture. And here are two very interesting maps. So this is a list of the major scripts that we do not, or we cannot yet decipher. So just for fun, I'll read them to you. The runic alphabet, the Etruscan, the Zapotec, the Olmec, the Isthmian, the Easter Island script, Rongo-Rongo, which, as I showed you, has curious and unexplained links with the valley in Pakistan, Meroitic, Indus script, yes, that's the one I was trying to think of, Proto-Elamitic, Linear A and Linear B. So although we have lots of early scripts, 12 of the most important ones we can't even read. And when we try to look at the world as a whole, where are the greatest concentrations of letters and alphabets? Here in the Congo area and here in the Pacific. Here is a map of all the language families. This is now, I think, 24. I told you that if we, the generally accepted one is that there are 10 major ones, and of those, 8 are influenced by Sanskrit. Here is a picture of Afro-Asiatic languages, where we see really 3 dominate, Arabic, Tuareg, and then these smaller ones like Hausa, and so on. Here is an other view with much fewer languages, and these are now alphabets rather than language families. And here is a smaller list still, which shows you Latin, Cyrillic, Arabic, Brahmic-based alphabets, mixed Latin and Cyrillic, Latin and Arabic, no alphabet, and other alphabet, and no alphabet in terms of logograms. Here is Wiki's view of the Aramaic, Cyrillic, Georgian, Greek, Latin, Latin and Arabic, Latin and Cyrillic, with Abjads, Arabic and Hebrew. Now I've shown you why that's not acceptable, because the Arabic has an alphabet version and an Abjad version. And even Hebrew has a version with vowels in the very early versions of Samaritan. And then the syllabaries are now called abugidas. So the Canadian syllabic alphabets are actually called abugidas, which makes no sense because that's ABGD or ABJD, whereas we showed in the introduction that that whole thing, that the structure of those alphabets comes from the Sanskrit. Well, now I'll give you some of those maps of alphabet letters. So here's one that says Egyptian is the beginning, that leads to Phoenician, that leads to Greek, Samaritan, Aramaean, and Sabaean, and then the other ones. Oh, and that Sabaean links to Old Indian, and that leads to Tamil, Tibetan, and Burmese. And that Tibetan leads to Sanskrit, and Sanskrit leads to Gujarati. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not convinced, because we showed you that the earliest Egyptian ones came from India, and secondly, the Phoenician came from Assyria and from the northwest coast of Saudi Arabia, namely in the Saracen alphabet. This version has gone all pale, but it again starts with Egyptian. Here are more conventional views of what happened. Proto-Canaanite leads to Ugaritic, leads to Phoenician. Then one branch leads to Aramaic, Syriac, Hebrew, Palmyran, Nabatean, Arabic, Persian. Another leads to Etruscan, Latin, Western. Another leads to Archaic Greek, Greek, Cyrillic. Another leads to Old Hebrew, Samaritan. Well, that's simply wrong because the Samaritan was the older one, and the Old Hebrew simply copied that. And then Proto-Arabic, Southern Arabian, Ethiopian. Well, that is also wrong because we saw that the Ethiopian is copied from the Indian. And here is another way of doing the same thing. And then there are two versions of where the Arabic comes from, one up north and one down south in this area. And here is yet another way of looking at this. So we have Proto-Semitic, which is supposed to start somewhere around here in the desert. That's supposed to lead to Eblaite, Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian. And the West Semitic then leads to Central Semitic, the South Arabian languages, so that's the rest of these, and then Canaanite, and then the Ethiopian is supposed to lead to Ge'ez, Tingriya, Amharic, and so on. But as we showed, this doesn't come downwards, this comes via the ocean there. And this is one of the more popular versions today. It all starts with Proto-Semitic, they say. That leads to Southern Semitic, Sabaean, Ethiopian. This leads, the Northern Semitic leads to Canaanite, Phoenician, early Hebrew. That leads to Aramaic and Greek. The Aramaic leads to Armenian and Georgian, modern Hebrew, Syrian, Uyghur, and Mongolian, Nabatean, and modern Arabic, and Brahmi, which then leads to North Indian, South Indian, and all of this. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I've shown you that the Armenian and Georgian alphabets were there 7,000 years ago, and that they had a very complex system. In fact, the Armenians had things going back to cave drawings of 19,000 years ago, and had then by between 7,000 and 6,000 had swastika as a grid system. And that certainly doesn't come from Aramaic because it's a 42-letter alphabet and not a 22-letter alphabet. But it's this model that convinced Diringer that the whole of what's called Nearer India comes from the coast of the Mediterranean, and that the whole spread of Brahmi to those 40 alphabets going all the way to Japan all comes from what happened in Syria sometime between 2000 and 1000 BC. Here is yet another version of, well, here is Diringer's map itself. So here's Proto-Semitic, Northern Semitic, Greek branch, Etruscan, Latin, English. South Ethiopian. This North Semitic has a branch that's Canaanite, Phoenician, Punic, and Neo-Punic, all right. Libyan, Iberian, all right. Early Hebrew, all right. But this Aramaic is supposed to produce Hebrew, Arabic, other offshoots, Indian branch, and then the further Indian branch. Well, this completely distorts the influence of the West because it takes that series of reduced alphabets of 22 letters as the model for the whole world and forgets the enormous richness of both the Slavic tradition and of the Indian tradition. So here is yet another way of looking at all of this. So now we have Afro-Asiatic causing the Semitic and Hamitic causing the Egyptian, the Cushitic, the Berber, and the Chadic. So basically now it's Africa opposed to what's happening along the Mediterranean, Well, it's very interesting, but again, it distorts in the sense that it's from India that we saw it comes to Africa, then goes up through Egypt, and then influences this. So to separate those two is again a distortion. Now, even the dating of when all of this happens, I showed you in the introductory lecture an example where Wiki decided that the original Indo-European was all around 3000 BC, and that only at 1000 BC did you start to split into these various branches. Well, here you have a claim that there is something called Nostratic, which leads on the one hand to Euro-Asiatic and on the other hand to Afro-Asiatic. And the dates are somewhere between 8 and 6000 BC, and then you get the splitting off. However, as I've shown you again in one of the lectures, the probable dates for the Indo-European version is more like 27 to 35,000 BC. And then the way in which Indo-European is described varies enormously as well. So here you have a version where we start with Indo-European, then we get Hittite, Armenian, Indo-Iranian, which goes to Hindustani, Urdu, and Bengali, and this one goes into Avestic and Persian, and then we get Thraco-Phrygian, Albanian, Greek, then Balto-Slavic, that gives you the Russian, Polish, Bulgarian, and so on, the Germanic, that gives you these ones, and German and Yiddish, and then the Scandinavian, well, Finnish, Flemish, Dutch, English, and so on, and here, and Plattdeutsch, and then here, Italo-Celtic, leading to Latin, Provençal, French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, Catalan, and Romanian. Given our story, it's rather amusing and bemusing that the word Sanskrit, which is really one of the fountains of all of this, doesn't get mentioned at all. And that Armenian, which we showed is linked with Georgian and also has links back to Alexandria in the later versions, doesn't get mentioned at all. And that there is a Slavic root that is independent of this thing, isn't mentioned at all. So, and here, two yet further ones. So here you have Indo-Iranian leading to Indic, Sanskrit, Bengali, Hindi, Urdu, and Gujarati. This one leading to Iranian and its things, then Hellenic, Celtic, Italic, and Balto-Slavic and Germanic. Here one done as a, almost like a fan. And here is a recent German one that finds the origins all in Mongolia and does it this way. I'm not here to preach one or the other. I'm inviting you to simply recall when you look at these charts that they look as if they're the whole truth, but in fact they are glimpses of the truth from a particular point of view, and they are normally written by people who have got a purely European view of things and have forgotten the rich and complex history that is behind the stories. For example, here is an Indian view of the major languages involved from the Sanskrit thing. So this is the eastward story in an abbreviated version. So in the north of India, Bengali, Devanagari, Gujarati, Gurmukhi, and Tibetan. In the southern Kannada, Malayalam, Oriya, Sinhala, Tamil, and Telugu. And then in Southeast Asia, on the mainland, Khmer and Thai, and then along the coast, Balinese, Baibayan, Javanese, and Lontara. Well, here you see a Brahmi numerals tree, very complex, that is totally forgotten about in the version that claims everything came from Aramaic. And if everything came from Aramaic, why did the East have not just zero, but numbers up to 100 billion at a time when zero wasn't even used in the West? And here are two maps of the founding of nations that seem to explain everything. And this, the three sons of Noah, of Ham, Shem, and Japheth. But the exact nature of those three sons is different in the Turkic explanation, in the Islamic explanation, and even in the Vedic texts. So we have been given one set of the story through the Bible, and as a Christian, I was brought up with the Bible, and it's a sacred text, and I respect it, but we need, if we're trying to understand the full story, then we should take the sacred texts of these other religions and compare them to try to get a greater sense of how all of these things really fit together. And what's fascinating is that if we go, for example, to the Austronesian language tree, we find that it spreads all the way over, not just to Indonesia and so on, and Australia, but really through all those islands. And here's another way of looking at that. In most Western views, this is simply ignored, as is this Turkic language tree, which, as I showed you, has languages all the way from Siberia to Middle Asia to what we now think is Turkey. And it includes languages like Altai, Ural, Dravio, Hind Avrupa, and so on. And Tatar, and Kazakh, and Uzbek, and Sumer, and Elam, and Etruscan. And they have their own explanation of where Etruscan comes from, which is again different from that of the Russians and different from the Europeans. In my 12th lecture, I gave you a grand scheme to show that there was not one source, but that were in fact 6 sources, one in China, one in India, one in the Slavic, and so on. And that was a first attempt to create a chart that reflects a world picture as opposed to one that just tries to impose the small subset of 72 sacred alphabets that became the sacred alphabets of the Catholic Church as the model for a world that has alphabets from 16 letters all the way to 200 or 300 or 600 letters. Thank you very much.